Hi, I'm Crystal. Today I'm presenting an interdisciplinary project between DeepMind and the Paris School of Economics, studying how large language models can replicate human behaviors in collective settings, specifically in the context of a group election task. Large language models are increasingly being used to simulate and describe human behavior, with promising results, from fidelity in survey responses to behaviors in economic games. They're also being used to model collective human behavior, both in simulated environments and in applied settings like negotiations and bargains. And large language models aren't just being used in simulation. They're already being deployed in real-world scenarios to help humans debate, reach consensus, and make more informed and normatively guided collective decisions. Given that these systems are already influencing decisions with real-world stakes, it's important that we study their alignment with human norms, particularly in collective settings. In this work, we conduct an empirical study with human participants in the context of an online group election task. From that data, we then produce a novel matched LLM-based simulacra population to examine whether humans and large language models exhibit similar collective outcomes, such as election winners. We want to study the following. First, we test individual alignment. We want to make sure that the large language model versions of real humans replicate their preferences and their performance. This step is critical. If the models fail to match the individuals, similarities at the aggregate group level could simply be artifacts of propagated misalignment. Then, we test group alignment, whether the large language model groups elect the same leaders as their human counterparts. Finally, we evaluate whether the leader that was elected was optimal, and the degree of that optimality. How does the quality of elected leaders compare between the humans and the models? We evaluate these questions in the context of the Lost at Sea social psychology task. In this task, groups of 4 participants converse, self-nominate, and elect a leader amongst themselves to complete a task on the group's behalf of prioritizing items while lost at sea. For example, the task may include asking whether a mirror or a case of army rations is more important to their survival, and there is an objective, correct answer as determined by the Coast Guard. The group's payoff is determined by the leader's performance, incentivizing the election of the most skilled leader. However, prior work finds a gender gap in who gets elected. This gap emerges through 2 mechanisms. On the left, we see the effects of self-exclusion, where women are less likely to self-nominate for the role of the leader. And on the right, we see the effect of pure exclusion, where, conditional on self-nominating, they're also less likely to be elected by others. We reproduce this Lost at Sea task in an online setting, recruiting roughly 800 participants via Prolific. Importantly, online interactions allow us to manipulate identity visibility cues that may affect pure exclusion. So, participants are randomly assigned to either an identified condition where they self-select their names and pronouns and avatars, or a pseudonymous condition where they are randomly assigned an animal-based profile. They then engage in discussions within a gender-balanced group of 4 participants, 2 male, 2 non-male, decide whether to self-nominate for the leader role, vote in the leader election, and finally, they complete that leader's task. Everybody completes the leader's task, but only the elected leader's score determines the group's bonus payout. This setup allows us to compute the optimal leader gap, that is, the ex post difference between the highest performing group member and the one that was actually elected. Once we get all the human data, we then created matched large language model agents for each human participant. Each agent is prompted with demographic information and contextualized using chain of thought prompts that propagate information across stages of the experiment. To evaluate alignment across different architectures, we test 4 models, 3 commercial models from the Gemini, GPT, and Claude families, and include data from an open model, Gemma, in the supplementary appendix. Here's what we found. First, there was no meaningful skill gap across genders in both the human and large language model populations. This is critical for our analyses. If there were significant performance differences across genders, it would be harder to disentangle the statistical discrimination from bias. However, all models reproduce the self-nomination gap between males and non-males, mirroring the pattern in the human data. So, the individual level foundations of the phenomena found in Bohr's recreation of Lost at Sea are in place. There's no difference in skill, but there is a difference in willingness to lead. We then examine how these group level patterns are propagated from the individual outcomes. Gemini and GPT serve as strong mirrors of collective behavior. If you'll see on the top bars, they're selecting the same leader as their human group around 45% of the time. Recall that there are 4 people in each group, so this is well above a chance alignment rate of 25%. By contrast, Haiku appears to perform no better than chance, seemingly suggesting a failure to model group dynamics, despite the individual alignment that we found earlier. We then evaluate the quality of the leader that is elected, comparing the performance of the elected leader with that of the optimal leader. Humans are perhaps, unsurprisingly, suboptimal at this task. There's a 14.5 percentage point performance gap between the optimal candidate and the one that was actually elected. This is in part due to that orange bar, the peer exclusion gap, where the optimal leader is not voted in by their peers, and in part due to self-nomination, that purple component, where they choose to not select to be the leader. Gemini, and to a lesser extent GPT, capture both the size and the structure of this optimal leader gap, modeling not just the degree of the outcome, but also its components. The more surprising result comes from Haiku. The Haiku populations are much better at electing the optimal leader compared to their human counterparts, solving the mystery of the misalignment in the previous slide. In the Haiku populations, the optimal leader almost always self-nominates and is then voted in by their peers, essentially eliminating both sources of suboptimal exclusion. Under pseudonymity, the self-exclusion gap persists. People self-nominate at roughly the same rate, but the peer exclusion gap shrinks. That is, when our participants can't see each other's demographic identifiers, they tend to elect better leaders. The Haiku sample actually performs worse under pseudonymity, suggesting that its strong performance in the identified condition may reflect some form of active masking or deliberately compensating for potential biases in order to achieve fairer outcomes. So in sum, in this work, we present empirical results from a behavioral experiment and matched LLM simulations on the Lost at Sea election scenario, examining alignment in collective reasoning. We find that, given identity cues, some models, like Gemini and GPT, closely mirror human outcomes. When the goal is to simulate collective human behavior, then, models operating in a mirror modality should be considered. However, this mirroring effect is not universal. Other models, Claude in particular, appeared to be masking human suboptimalities, suppressing biases that emerge in social judgments. This masking behavior can be useful in normative contexts, especially in decisions with real-world consequences, such as hiring, healthcare, and performance evaluation. Our work calls for a deeper conception of alignment, one that explores the tension between descriptive fidelity and normative aspiration. Should models reflect human behavior as it is, or as we wish it to be? Looking forward, we're exploring whether models can be steered between modalities through techniques such as prompting or fine-tuning. That is, can we reliably shift a model from mirroring to masking behavior, depending on the task context? Finally, we call upon interdisciplinary communities to continue in exploring collective simulation with grounding in matched human data. As we found in our study, individual simulacra may appear well aligned, but their collective behavior in group contexts can diverge substantially due to model-specific idiosyncrasies. These dynamics warrant careful study and even more careful deployment in applied settings moving forward. Thank you for your time.